back in the 1970s, and this was about 40 years ago, so a long time before any of you were born, when the space program first started. We went into orbit in space capsules. The first capsules held one astronaut, then they went to two astronaut space capsules, and we orbited the Earth. Ryan, no reason for you to be talking.
You're lying.
And then we got into exploring the moon. President Kennedy declared that before the end of a decade, we would land man on the moon and safely return him to the Earth. That was our charge as a nation. That drove our technology for about the next 10 years. It also changed NASA into the National Aeronautics and Space Administration from a smaller research agency that was a subgroup off the Air Force. When astronauts first went into space, they orbited the Earth, then they did spacewalks. One astronaut stayed in the spacecraft, the other one went out. When we got to 3 astronaut spacecraft, they went up to the moon. They started by orbiting the moon. I heard somebody say Neil Armstrong and Apollo 11. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on Apollo 11 were the first astronauts to actually land on the moon and to set foot on the moon. Apollo 12 landed on the moon. Apollo 13 was planned to do the same thing. Space travel has always been and will always be a rather dangerous occupation. When the astronauts were trying out the first full-scale test of the Apollo 1 spacecraft on the launch pad, there was a tragic accident that happened where the 3 astronauts died. A fire broke out inside the spacecraft. The astronauts were not able to get out of the spacecraft, and they died as a result of the fire. When the space shuttle program was first being developed, there was an assembly technician that was crushed to death when the orbiter was being mounted on the main rocket engine in the vehicle assembly building. In 1986, when the orbiter Challenger took off, it was supposed to be the first mission that would go up to have the first teacher in space. 90 seconds after liftoff, there was a problem with one of the seals on the solid rocket booster, and it let flame come out the side of the rocket engine. It ignited the main fuel tank. The fuel tank exploded. The astronauts did not survive the explosion. And about 5 or 6 years ago, when the orbiter Challenger, the orbiter Columbia was landing, on takeoff, part of the insulation broke off the main fuel tank and punched a hole in the leading edge of the left wing, opening up an area where the insulation tiles were not covering it. On re-entry to Earth and landing, the heat from re-entry got in, it burned the wing off, and the spacecraft disintegrated. It came down in basically a debris trail that went from California to Texas. The astronauts did not survive. There have been a lot of tragedies that have happened on the Russian space program with the Russian cosmonauts, and when they had their space station called the Vera, there was a lot of problems with that. Unfortunately, because information does not pass freely, sometimes from Russia, we don't know the full extent of what their problems were. The space travel has always been a rather dangerous occupation, and it will always be one. When the space program was first started, they gave the astronauts that were on the original Mercury series of spacecrafts, and they all did survive. They gave them about a 25% chance of surviving. So most of the astronauts at that point were military pilots from the Air Force, the Navy, and Marine, the majority of them being test pilots. Apollo 13 was supposed to be the 3rd mission to explore the moon. It was supposed to be the 3rd mission to land on the moon, do some scientific exploration, collect a few hundred pounds of boom rocks can come back to